All right, something a little different today. I've got here a large medieval knife, not a messer, but a Bauernwehr, or peasant's defense. This is from Landsknecht Emporium. I'm going to review it, but first I want to change the handle scales here, which I don't like at all. They're super blocky and uncomfortable. I have a blunt sparring version with the same handle scales that I can use for review to reference the difference. So while I do that, I figured I'd talk a little bit about weapons and their association with violence and war and all that. I've touched on this before, but I've never made a dedicated video about it, which I think is in order. So when you think about weapons and weapon collecting and all that, that's usually the way it's done now is disconnected from the historical reality, from the horrors of war and armed violence and all that. And I think that in and of itself is fine, of course. Like, we generally, as weapon collectors, we don't glorify violence. Most of us, at the very least. There are always some weirdos in a bad way. And personally, I approach historical arms and armor and combat in this sort of detached way with an academic interest, without sterilizing or trivializing the horrors of armed fighting. Sometimes people are a little confused about how you can be into weapons and anti-war at the same time. Because, of course, the original purpose of weapons is to damage and destroy other human beings, right? But anything can be recontextualized. Originally, bows were made to end lives, whether it be human or animal or both. But then, of course, eventually people decided, hey, this makes for a really neat sport. So let's just shoot at paper targets instead, or other objects. And same thing with weapons, like swords, for example. Yeah, they were made to fight. You know, a sword really has no other purpose. This here is a little bit of an in-between. This is a tool, but also a self-defense weapon for civilians, commoners. So sometimes those things bleed over into one another, but generally a sword has violent purposes originally. But now, of course, we can collect them and we can do things like tatami cutting, which, you know, you can argue simulates this sort of original use or trains you to do that or whatever. But of course, the purpose is not that. Like, yeah, there might be a few psychos in the sword community who fantasize about using a sword on another person, IRL, the same way as, you know, some gun nuts do, but it's generally a minority. When I say I'm against war, you can interpret that in different ways. So let me clarify. I mean that in a pretty absolute way. Like, war in general is bad. There are justifiable instances. If you get attacked, you have to defend yourself. You know, that's pretty obvious. That doesn't make the war good. It just makes your response to being attacked justified. Does that make sense? The same goes for violence in other contexts. If you're being assaulted, you know, just unjustifiably attacked, then of course you have to defend yourself. And in doing so, whatever violence you apply, shall we say, is justified. Well, for the most part. You can definitely cross a line, and there are laws about that. You know, like if you've already fended the attacker off and now you chase them, or like the attacker's on the ground and now you start stomping or whatever, that, yeah, okay, you've crossed the line, right? So either way, the violence is bad. You know, even if it happens in a justifiable way, I see it as a necessary evil. You know, I'd rather nobody be harmed in any way, but I'm not absolutely pacifistic in the sense that you can never use violence. No, of course, there are situations in which you can and should, you know, to defend yourself and others. A war of defense or liberation is justified, of course, although liberation is subject to propaganda. I mean, all war is, really. So, in that sense, perfectly legitimate, justifiable, but still an evil. Even if a necessary evil, it's still an evil. And nothing really illustrates the tragedy of it more than soldiers in the trenches celebrating Christmas together, like in the Second World War. Like, these are people who come together and acknowledge each other's humanity, form bonds, and then they go back to slaughtering each other just because orders from high up tell them so. And that's another problem that I personally have with the whole thing. The ones who start wars are not the ones fighting in them, generally. Whereas I think, really, if you're in charge and you start a war, you should be right there fighting at the front lines. Is this tactically sound, risking your leader's life? They might be hard to replace in a organizational, tactical sense, but should it be like that? In my opinion, absolutely. Would leaders be less likely to start wars? Yes, and that's part of the point. If you're not willing to risk your own hide, then maybe don't start a war. Don't risk the lives of young men who do not have any gripes with the enemy outside of propaganda. Again, there are different situations, again, liberation, defense, etc. All of that is a different story. But either way, the attacker, the evil, villainous enemy, is also subject to this kind of propaganda and deception and all that. And really, at the end of the day, I think life has way more value than it's often granted in these kinds of decisions. I want everybody to have a chance to live a long and fulfilling life. There are some people that the world would be better off without, and those simply shouldn't have influence over other people's lives. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have their own, in my opinion. Maybe there are extreme cases where that doesn't hold true. But outside of those, the way I see it, and of course it's not a unique perspective by any means, everybody has the right to a free and peaceful life unless they interfere with someone else's ability to do the same. Similar to the paradox of tolerance. If you don't tolerate other people living their life the way they see fit without harming anybody else, and you become intolerant of them or their lifestyle or whatever, then you forfeit the right to tolerance because you've broken the social contract. So that's why intolerance should not be tolerated. It's not a contradiction, it's just part of the deal. So my interest in historical arms and armor and weapons in general, including firearms, is really based on the technological side of it. Like in case of a simple knife like this, it's not that much technology if you think about it, but at the same time, there is a lot that goes into the design. Exactly how the blade is shaped. There are plenty of nuances in this that affect how it's used, how effective it is, etc., right? And of course, in case of firearms, that goes much deeper because those are much more complicated, complex machines, if you will. Very interesting in terms of just how it's made, how it works, the experience of firing it, how it feels, and all that. It's an absolutely terrible thing, obviously. Has caused a great loss of life and pain and all of that. But again, you can recontextualize things and use them in a different way. What used to be a device of mass slaughter can be a recreational item or a collector's item. Again, it's good to be aware of the unsavory origin, shall we say, and not gloss it over and again, trivialize and glorify all of this. But you can still see it through a different lens. Of course, as collectors, we don't need to justify ourselves. Nothing that we do is illegal. It's perfectly legitimate and everything. But I still find it good to acknowledge these things explicitly every now and then. Because, again, there are some questionable individuals in every community, and it's just realistic to acknowledge the origin of all that instead of just being like, well, there's just cool stuff, That applies, of course, to things like movies and video games as well. Every now and then there's some moral panic about video games, about how they're going to make the kids violent. There doesn't seem to be any real evidence that happens. There are ways to desensitize people, which is done in the military, of course. And, there are ways, for example, there are studies that found that people working in slaughterhouses have a tendency to become sadistic toward the animals. They get so desensitized, they have to disconnect from all the suffering that they see on a daily, that eventually it doesn't faze them anymore, and then I don't really know what causes them to cross that line from being apathetic toward suffering to causing it themselves. There might be a hypothesis in that study. I don't remember all the details. So there are definitely situations where people can lose their empathy and just stop caring about these things. But in general, I feel like the vast majority of collectors and other people who are interested in weapons or violent video games, for that matter, are not like that. There is just a certain entertainment value to abstracted violence, shall we say, because most games have it. Even like the most benign platformer, classic example would be Mario, of course, has violence in it. Like the enemies are being dispatched through force. So it's just generally something, and even sports have simulated violence of some kind. So it's just part of the human existence, condition, whatever, right? And depending on how it's done, you can kind of sanitize it a little bit in a good way. If you think about something like Castlevania, fighting the forces of darkness, things that threaten humanity. How do you fight them? Well, with violence, of course, by whipping them with a chain. Of course, fiction is a little more appealing because it can take away a lot of the moral ambiguity that you have in real life, even when it comes to fairly obvious good guy, bad guy dynamics, as in the Second World War. It's not quite that simple when you really look into it. The quote-unquote good guys have also committed atrocities, and things are a little messier in the real world, which you don't have to have in a fictional setting. Now, a lot of people appreciate that, myself included. I can appreciate a somewhat more nuanced presentation. Typically, villains who are not just villains for the sake of being evil are more satisfying, right? Complex motivations are definitely better. Even then, I feel like even complex villains are a little less messy than the real world. So it's nice to indulge in that every now and then, and just imagine a world that's a little simpler, a world in which good prevails. And I guess that's what this is, kind of the underdog. It may not be quite as impressive and visually pleasing as a sword made for a noble, but, this is a tool and self-defense weapon for a peasant, the lowest in society, the exploited, that society can't exist without. So I guess there's some beauty in that. Of course, nothing I'm saying here is new. So much has been said and done already, and there's no groundbreaking revelation here. But I just felt like talking about these things because I feel like even though I've touched on the topic in the past, I haven't really tackled the topic in quite this way explicitly before. So let me know what you think about that. I guess if you're not into weapons, you've probably not found this video, let alone made it all the way through. But if by any chance someone has found their way there who's not really into this kind of stuff, let me know what you think in particular. What do you think about the origin, the violent origins of this, and what do you think about people collecting weapons and using them in repurposed peaceful ways like tatami cutting? And of course, cosplay is also another one of those cases where weapons are repurposed. Now, of course, it's not actual weapons because they're made of foam, but they're still made to look like them, and they're still going after the epic appeal of them, I suppose, the symbolic value and the coolness factor and all of that, which is very, very common. You don't have to be part of a super small niche to appreciate weapons and all that. Now, of course, not that cosplay is super mainstream, but more common than collecting swords, I would think. Anyway, just some ramblings. Again, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. I'll just finish this up.